So let's think about this annual plan a little bit and just kind of look at the way it's structured. So let's start with training periods. So a training period consists of kind of 2 or 3 mesocycles, maybe 2 to 3 months worth of training. And they are then designed to meet the specific objective. And they establish the patterns and the boundaries of the subcomponents or the phases. So remember, the periods are your preparation, your competition. Transition doesn't have subdivision, but it is classed as a period. And then sitting within the competition and the preparation, you obviously have the pre-competition, competition, and the general prep and the specific prep, each of which has a specific objective based upon the needs of the athletes. So what you need to think about are, what's the objective of each microcycle, so that's weeks worth of training, and then objective of each mesocycle. You need to think about the number of training units, how much training can the athlete actually be exposed to, which differs depending on whether they're trained, untrained, whether they are in a skill-based sport as opposed to maybe a more strength and power or even endurance-based sport. You need to think about the number of repetitions, the sets, the intensity. You need to think about the degree of flexibility. You can't stick rigidly to the plan. As much as we have a plan, you have to be adaptable, and the athlete has to be adaptable to a certain degree because things get in the way. They get injured, they get ill, they get outside influences, all of which we have to take into account, and we have to adjust the plan accordingly, still trying to meet the objectives. And again, the objectives may need to fluctuate as we move through the year. Now, if we look at this schematic here, this is quite a nice way of thinking about what is going on. They've put this kind of transition phase in here, which is a little bit odd, and they've done it because they've kind of got technique training. But generally, what you've got is preparation phase, the period, then the competition period, then the overall transition period. And what it shows us is the general understanding in terms of periodization, which is that in the preparatory phase, volume is high, intensity is somewhat lower. But as you move from the preparatory phase into the competition phase, what you start to notice is we bring the volume down, which allows us to bring the intensity up. We're trying to get the athlete now up to competition-based intensity. And this is really what makes linear periodization, linear planning, different to what we use when we see, for example, modulations or undulating-based periodization. In those plans, you don't have this kind of formulaic approach, which is this quite uniform distribution of volume versus intensity. And that's because undulating or modulating periodization is generally used in team sport situations, whereas this is very much used for kind of more linear-based sports. So you wouldn't use this linear-based periodization, for example, in sports like football or even in something like tennis, which has got a long competition period. It has just multiple competitions. And in football, they're competing almost every week, as an example, as they are in rugby. So where you've got smaller competition periods or smaller major competition periods, you use linear approaches. Where you are having competitions almost every week, you would use an undulating plan in terms of periodization. Now, how does this all structure? And this is kind of just going back to some stuff we've developed before. This is kind of a representation that I like to use, which I like to think about training in terms of pyramids. So when we think about the Great Pyramids of Giza in Egypt, the height of the pyramid is really a function of the size of its base. The bigger that base is, the more stable the pyramid is, and therefore the taller we can make the pyramid. And training is very much like that. So what you have is volume is at a low intensity, and therefore, that's why those two have that kind of inverse relationship that we saw in the previous schematic. As we start to bring the intensity up, the volume of training, what they actually do becomes less and less and less. So this representation here is AB is aerobic base, LT is lactate threshold training, HI is high intensity, RS is repeated sprints, and then SI is sprint interval training. So we can't tolerate high volumes of sprint interval training, but we can tolerate higher volumes of aerobic base training. Concurrent with that then are these chevrons, which represent our recovery. The amount of recovery we need is therefore a function of the intensity. So as the intensity increases and therefore the volume decreases, we require more recovery between each of the sessions compared to what we do when we look at the kind of the lower intensity training down here. Excuse me.